You remain constructive on Chinese equities. What do you like in China specifically?
Great. I'm glad we're coming back to China. In the first half, we talked about some of the consumer names, F&B, QSR, logistics companies. We can also talk about tech hardware. Now, I know earlier I was saying if you look at wafers, at the SPE sectors in North Asia outside of China, it's trickier now. But it's trickier because of what is happening on the mainland and how rapidly progress is being made. If you take it sector by sector, the biggest end markets over the next decade will be the automotive sector still. It's the largest manufacturing industry in the world. Robotics, so that supply chain, reduction gears, the components that go into robots, humanoids, yes, it's still very early, but that's where we're spending our time. If you look at factory automation, some of the, continuing with the robotics theme, but also going more broadly, laser companies, companies that are involved, machine tool companies, companies that are upstream of some of the companies that we typically talk about. So on the tech hardware side, there's a lot of opportunities. Semiconductor companies over the last decade have grown very rapidly. They have grown the top line, they've expanded margins, they're getting better and better at allocating capital and investing in the right technologies. So if you look at the size and scale of these companies today compared to 8 years ago, when President Trump came into the White House for the first time, these are completely different companies, much larger, much more integrated, and that's an area of fertile investment grounds as well, we think.
So you're talking about the Chinese memory catching up with some of the leading countries like South Korea, for example. Do you think China will get to a similar point, a same level of growth, meaningful growth in terms of EUVs and perhaps some of the fancy AI-related chips like high bandwidth memory chips as well in the near future?
What we've learned as a team, and I think what markets have learned over the past 20 years, is that irrespective of the sector, if it is important to China's growth in the long term, the country and its engineers will figure things out. 20 years ago, we started talking about shipbuilding in China, and look at the strides that have been made there. Then we looked at infrastructure companies, the automotive sector, EUVs, the strength of that sector now. And now we're seeing the same thing in the semiconductor sector. We have learned not to underestimate the pace of the progress and the magnitude of the progress in China. So yes, when we look at these sectors, we see that there are a lot of opportunities with good reason.
You mentioned humanoids. I think this is a big part of the U.S. and China competition story, perhaps a critical part of the conversation over the next 5 years or so. How do you get that exposure? What are some of the sectors that could get me exposure in China to humanoids?
Well, we started looking at this the way we typically have thought about robots. Or machines over the last 2 decades. We looked at machine tool companies, we looked at reduction gear companies, the hardware. And then we started, the more time we spent on it, we realized how important data is for humanoids. How do these humanoids get the data, the sensors that are on them, the computing power that is inside them? And so that's where we are spending our time now. And there aren't very many companies in China that we found yet that are in the public space, but there are many in the private space, a few of which will soon be listed, and so that's where we're spending our time. But I would say that it's not just about the hardware that you see, it's about the sensors on these robots and the computational power inside that will drive the growth opportunities in this sector. It's going to be quite large. There's also a very interesting dichotomy between what companies in China and in Korea are saying about the humanoid space and what companies in Japan are saying. We find that the Japanese companies for now have been a little bit more conservative in at least explicitly mentioning how big this opportunity could be, whereas in South Korea we find there's a lot of excitement. In China we find there's a lot of excitement, again, on the hardware side but on the software side as well.
Yeah, I just want to point out, if we could rerun that video we were just watching, right? Humanoid robot, Chinese made, right? Running and completing a half marathon, I think, which is really something on a single charge, I suppose, right?
Yes.
But listen, Vikas, undergirding and underpinning everything that China makes, and they are very good at making stuff. They are the factory of the world, right? Is software. I think the thing we haven't talked about yet, including as an investment theme, is this it's AI explosion right now, which is happening in China, right? That's got to mean opportunity for you, right? Because, and I know it's hard, right? Because I suspect what's going to happen now, maybe what is already happening now, is what happened with solar panels, with EVs, et cetera, right? Everybody wants to get in on the act, right? The government is happy to fund them and seed them, maybe private capital as well. But there's going to be a shakeout. It's going to be like Hunger Games, right? So I mean, this may be the time to invest, but also you have to be very, very careful who you pick.
Well, we try always to be very careful and selective with what we pick, but this point is exactly right. We had this insight about a decade ago when we thought in biologic terms that when animals started to get eyes, the size of the brain went up a lot. And so the same thing happened with computing power. When you started giving computers eyes, then the demand for memory, the demand for computing power went up a lot. We see that in the case of GPUs for AI training, but we see that even before that for smartphones and PCs. The more and more sensors that we applied, the more vision that we gave them, the more data that came in. And now we're seeing the same thing with humanoids, which is why these same series of insights has taken us from just looking at the shoulders and the elbows and the arms and the reduction gears and the hardware that you see to sensors and data. This is where companies will differentiate themselves, and this is where we're spending our time.
I mean, ultimately, what we're talking about is replicating the brain, right? And at some stage, technology becoming almost or near sentient.
Yes. So it's very interesting times, conceptually, hypothetically, but for investors as well. There will be a lot of investment opportunities here. We also think about just the form factor of the robots. We have an idea of what a humanoid should look like. People who are old enough like me remember the Jetsons and what robots should look like. Yeah. But that's not necessarily what they will look like. And the fact that we have humanoids competing in a half marathon, for me, it's not as interesting that they lost. It's that we are here already. And we have made so much progress already. The next few years will be very, very interesting.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, what is the premise around China's self-sufficiency when it comes to the humanoids or, I don't know, the whole AI supply chain as well when you build your portfolios? Can China be, I don't know, mostly self-sufficient in all this, or does it need some of these other countries like South Korea or the US, Japan, to build this AI vision?
This is a very important question. And what we have seen again and again if we just confine our thoughts to the semiconductor industry, wafers, semiconductor production equipment, memory, the three big areas that we spend a lot of time on, the three big areas within advanced computing, China is becoming self-sufficient. If we look, let's just start with memory again. If we look at DRAM, based on what we have seen, somewhere between 10 to 12% of capacity now is in mainland China being used by domestic consumption. China's demand for DRAM is probably 3 times that, somewhere between 25 to 30%. They have a goal of self-sufficiency. And the fact that they're already at 10 to 12% signals to us that they're going to make that progress. They are going to get there. So if they can do that in DRAM, which is very complicated, very sophisticated, then we should assume that they will do that in NAND, that the Chinese companies will do the same thing in various other supply chain, parts of the supply chain for humanoids as well. We've seen what they've done with EUVs and the battery supply chain, rare earths. So yes, it would be folly to underestimate the capabilities in the semiconductor industry in China.
You know, less high-tech, but still high-tech, from robots, robotics, humanoid robots to planes, right? We had news that a Chinese airline was supposed to take delivery of a Boeing, a 737, and said, nope, government says can't do that, got to send it back all the way, right? 4,000 kilometers with 2 stops in Guam and Hawaii, et cetera, right? Which is raising the prospect, and, you know, we were talking, I think, when Xi Jinping was making his tour of Southeast Asia with Vietnam, with Malaysia as well, AirAsia, talking about potentially buying Chinese-made commercial aircraft. I mean, robots, maybe that's a couple of years away, right? But with something like commercial aviation, do you see the likelihood that there could be 2 separate spheres, right? Boeings and Airbuses, and then China comes along with their CN aircraft, Comac aircraft. And that's probably nearer term, right? A possibility.
It is possible. I think we're going to see this across sectors. The aerospace industry is one that I spend less time on, and more on semiconductors, more on life sciences. But the pattern recognition is signaling the same, that we're going to see this bifurcation across many sectors. It might not be the base case yet, but the probability of it happening is rising. And the fact that it can happen in semiconductors and the fact that it can happen in commercial aviation means that can happen in other things as well. EUVs, if you look at the lead that many the leading Chinese EUV companies have compared to Western counterparts, that lead is quite sizable. That bifurcation has happened, and that should continue. I should say, however, that we shouldn't extrapolate the present in perpetuity. We shouldn't completely dismiss what is the technological advances happening in Europe, and of course the U.S. It remains the center of innovation for all of these technologies that we've been talking about. If you just look at computing, maybe the Asian engineers and companies are able to increase the yields in the production of legacy memory. But when we think about the future of computing, optical computing, a lot of the leading work is happening in Europe and the US. There's work happening in Asia as well. But these things will evolve. We shouldn't dismiss anybody, certainly not the Chinese, but we shouldn't dismiss Western Europe or the US either.